Last week, Presonus published an update to Studio One, and this is actually a fairly big one. It introduces surround sound and Dolby Atmos capabilities in Studio One. Now, without spoiling too much, I can already say that this is a fairly spectacular upgrade. However, as always, the devil is in the details, and there are quite a few details that you might want to be aware before jumping full in. So let's talk about it. Before I get started, I'd like to make two comments. The first one is that this is not a sponsored video. Everything that I'm going to talk about today is based on software that I purchased myself. Nobody had any influence on what I'm going to say whatsoever. Everything is strictly my own opinion. The second thing is that I'm going to work with Windows today, but everything that I'm going to show you works on Macs as well, with two minor exceptions, and I'm going to point that out once we get to them. And with that being said, let's get started. One of the things that I found particularly interesting in the way Presonus implemented the Dolby Atmos workflow is that this workflow is not in your face. So if you are not really interested in working with Dolby Atmos and you only want to use Studio One in a traditional way as a stereo digital audio workstation, you can do that, and it's not going to constantly remind you that this is a Dolby Atmos capable DAW. If you don't want to use Dolby Atmos, you don't have to use Dolby Atmos, and it's going to work in exactly the way it always worked. And this is particularly interesting because I see a lot of companies these days that have somewhat lost the connection to their customer base. And in this particular case, this is a refreshing exception. Presonus obviously knows that a lot of people who are using Studio One are using it for stereo only and aren't really interested in Dolby Atmos. So by doing it in that particular way, they essentially open up this new market of people who are interested in Dolby Atmos without alienating the ones that are already working with Studio One and have no interest in going into surround sound. And this is aided by the fact that this is only a 0.5 upgrade. So while this is a massive update to Studio One that introduces a lot of new features, Presonus decided to not do a full version upgrade. And that essentially means that everybody who owns Studio One version 6 can upgrade for free. And nobody needs to be upset that Presonus went all in with Dolby Atmos. And even if you're not interested in Dolby Atmos, this 0.5 update to Studio One still has a couple of really interesting features for you. In particular, it is now interoperable with certain other digital audio workstations, and there's also a Linux beta of Studio One. So all in all, I have to say, very well done, Presonus. But enough said, let's jump into Studio One. Now, if you want to start a Dolby Atmos project, there are really two ways on how you can do that. The first one is by using the Dolby Atmos template, and for that you would go to the New button here. And if you open that up, you can essentially go to the Mix in Surround template, and that will then allow you to create a new Dolby Atmos project. The second option is to just do the setup of Dolby Atmos manually, and this is what we're going to do here because it is actually surprisingly simple in Studio One. So let's just do that. Let's create a new song. And now in this particular video, I'm not going to talk too much about what exactly Dolby Atmos is. I did a couple of videos previously where I talked in detail about Dolby Atmos. If you're new to Dolby Atmos, I recommend you watch those first. I'm going to leave some links in the description below. The nice thing about Studio One is that you actually don't have to know a lot of things about Dolby Atmos because the workflow is so super simple. The first thing that we need to do is we need to add the Dolby Atmos renderer to our project, and in Studio One this is done by going into the Song menu and in particular into the Spatial Audio settings. And in the Spatial Audio settings we need to change the Spatial Audio mode from Surround, which is the default, to Dolby Atmos. And then we can select all the individual parameters for Dolby Atmos. We can select the bed format. By default this is set to 7.1.2. Now if you're new to Dolby Atmos, don't worry too much about the bed format, just use this default. That is what most people are using. Then we need to select the output format, which is the format that the Dolby Atmos renderer is outputting to. Now we can actually change that while we are producing, and we are going to see in a second how that works, but let's just leave that at stereo for now. And then we need to select the sample rate, which is by default 48 kilohertz. If you have worked with Dolby Atmos, you know there are only two options in Dolby Atmos. You can either set that to 48 kilohertz or 69 or 96 kilohertz. I'm going to leave it at 48 kilohertz here, and then I'm saying apply, and as soon as I do that, I'm going to be greeted with the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this, by the way, is also the window that I'm going to be greeted with if I chose the template at the very beginning. So if I didn't go through the setup manually, but instead went through the template, this is really everything that I need to do in order to set up a Dolby Atmos project, and I'm now ready to go. Now, one of the nicest things about this particular workflow is that you are not really bothered with any routing that you have to do. In many other digital audio workstations, you are now required to set up the routing for the individual objects and all the outputs and all these kind of things. In Studio One, this is completely transparent. So there's nothing you need to do. You don't need to worry about where objects are routed to. You don't need to worry about where the bed is routed to. Everything is done within Studio One in a way that doesn't really bother you, that is, once again, not really in your face, and you can just start working in Dolby Atmos. So let's add a couple of things. So let me close the Dolby Atmos render window for a moment because I don't really need that right now. And let's maybe also open up the mix view. Now, the nice thing about Studio One is that you can actually see most of the important information from the Dolby Atmos render in this mix view. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but essentially you have all the controls really that you need. You can control the bed format, you can control the output format, you see the loudness and all those parameters. You have a volume knob here that allows you to control the overall volume of your Dolby Atmos production, which is really, really nice. But before I kind of go into the details, let me first drop a audio file into my session. And I actually kind of prepared something here. And for those of you who have watched my channel for a while know these tunes. That is essentially something that I used in one of my game design videos or game audio videos. So let me just, and maybe I should also kind of take my headphones, otherwise I'm not going to hear anything. And let's play what we have here. And you can already see that the audio is already reaching the Dolby Atmos renderer. I didn't really do anything. It is already kind of set up. The way it is set up by default is that the audio reaches the bed channels, which are essentially the first 10 channels. Currently, I'm not really panning anything, so it's coming in at left and right channels. Now, in order to pan that signal, what I would have to do is I would have to go into the panner. And this is now the surround panner. And I can pan that signal, and as I pan that signal, I see that it is coming in the bed channels. I can also kind of elevate it, kind of bring that up a little. Now the panner has a couple of different options. You can either pan traditionally, or there's also a balance panner. And more interestingly, there's also a snap function. So if you want to, for example, have the panner snap to the speaker positions, you can actually do that by selecting that snap. And if I'm now kind of, and you're probably not going to see that very well on your screen, but if I'm getting close to the speaker for the center speaker here, for example, if I let that go, it will snap into the center position. And that can be very, very useful. So the way this works is that anything that is routed into the track that holds the Dolby Atmos renderer is assumed to be part of the bed. And that essentially also means that you don't have to set up a separate bed bus. That is already kind of taken care of for you. There's nothing that you have to set up here. Now, obviously, we usually don't really want to work only with the bed. We want to work with objects in Dolby Atmos. So let's have a look on how we are going to turn that into an object. And in Studio One, this is done very, very simply by changing the panner. So we go into the track settings here and we right-click where the panner is. And then essentially I have the option to choose the surround panner or the spatial object panner. And the main difference is very, very straightforward. If you choose the spatial object panner, it pans into an object or actually a pair of objects. And if you choose the surround panner, it pans into the bed. And that's really all there is to it. So let's just change that to the spatial object panner. As soon as I do that, you will see first of all, I see a different panner here. And then I see that in the Dolby Atmos renderer, I now have an object. And and that's also something that's probably a little difficult to see. I have the location of those objects here visible in the view of the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, in a traditional setup with a Dolby Atmos renderer, you quite often see these little circles that are 128 circles where you essentially see which object is coming in and how objects are connected. In Studio One, you don't need to have to worry about that. So everything is sort of taken care of for you. You don't have to worry about routing the objects to particular object channels. This is already done. So this is very, very easy and very, very straightforward to do. And by kind of simply doing that, I have now changed that track into an object track, or actually a pair of objects. So if I play that again, I now see that it's no longer coming in at the bed, but where is it coming in? It is coming in as an object. And one of the nice things also is that I can now mute the object from within the renderer. So if I select mute here, I've muted that object, or I can also solo the object from within the renderer. This is another really nice feature. Now, if I close the renderer, I see that many of these options are also visible. Oops, that was probably a little too early. I should kind of have the sound left enabled. So essentially, I see all the individual parameters that are important for me. I see the loudness, I see the output, I see the bed channel. So if I'm switching that back to the bed, I essentially see that the bed is coming in here. And so I don't even need to open up the Dolby Atmos renderer. I can do everything from within the mix session. Now, even though I have the output of the Dolby Atmos renderer set to stereo, I actually don't need to leave it that way. I can actually switch that around. So what I can do is I can go here to the output settings and essentially change that to binaural or any other format. I can also do that by opening up the Dolby Atmos renderer and do that within the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's set that to binaural, for example. Let's play that again. So I now have the audio in binaural. And I can even set that to higher channel counts. So for example, I can set that to 9.1.6. Now, I currently only have a stereo hardware output, so not all of the 16 channels are actually routed to my audio interface. And you can actually set that up, how that is routed, by going into the song settings, into spatial audio. And here in the audio input-output settings, I can go to outputs, and then I can essentially select what is routed to the output. Here I currently see it has detected that I'm using 16 outputs from the Dolby Atmos renderer, but I only have 2 physical outputs, so I have 14 unused outputs, and I'm going to come back to that a little bit later when we're going to talk about plugins that I can essentially put after the Dolby Atmos renderer, or insets that I can put after the Dolby Atmos renderer. But Studio One now has surround sound capabilities, so I'm not only limited to mono and stereo tracks, I can also set up tracks with higher channel counts. So let's see how that works. And for that, let me first close that window here, and then let's maybe set that back to stereo. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. And let's close the panner here and the window. And if I want to add a track that has a high channel count, I can simply do that by add a track. And as soon as I do that, I see here the format. So I can select what type of format I want. So for example, I can select I want a 9.1.6 track. And I can simply add that, and that track will then be part of my project. Now I can route that into the Dolby Atmos renderer, and this is actually routed into the bed by default. And unfortunately, at least at the current state of the Dolby Atmos implementation of Studio One, you cannot turn that into objects. So in many other digital audio workstations, what you can do is you can turn multi-channel tracks into individual objects, so that a 9.1.6 track, for example, would be turned into 16 objects. You can't do that in Studio One, at least not now. If you have anything that is more than stereo, it will automatically be routed into the bed of the Dolby Atmos renderer. But it is at least nice to know that I can use multi-channel tracks in Studio One, even though I can only route them into the bed of the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, there's one additional limitations. Instruments, at least now, can only be stereo. There are ways around that, and I might actually do a video about that, but at the moment at least, I was not able to use multi-channel instruments. So for example, if you have Skydust 3D, which is an instrument that can output 9.1.6 surround sound, you cannot use that within Studio One, or let me clarify, you can only use that in stereo mode within Studio One. Now, one of the main reasons why you would use an Atmos Bed in a Dolby Atmos project is in order to hold the reverb. So if you have a track that is sent into objects and you want to add reverb to that, you would like that reverb to be completely immersive. And the best way to do that is to go through the Dolby Atmos Bed. And in Studio One, this is something that is very easy to set up. So let's do that. So let me first delete that multi-channel track, because I don't really need that anymore. So let's remove that. And then I also need to switch the panner back to the spatial object panner, so that we have the track coming in as an object into the Dolby Atmos renderer. So let's maybe open up the Dolby Atmos renderer here. And what I want to do now is I want to simply duplicate that signal and send that, in addition to being sent as an object into the renderer, also into the bed channel, where I'm then going to add a reverb in order to kind of create that reverb of that particular object. So in order to do that, let me just add a send here to the main. That essentially means that it is reaching the Dolby Atmos renderer on the bus. Let me just play the audio again to see that everything works. So as you can see, the audio is coming in here and as a bed, and then essentially also as an object here. And then the last thing that I need to do is I need to add a reverb to the inserts here on this main track. This is a 7.1.2 track once again, and there are a couple of different options. You can obviously use the reverbs that come with Studio One, but I'm going to use Cinematic Rooms from Liquid Sonics. So let's do that. And then we have Cinematic Rooms. Now, if you add a plugin to a multi-channel track, make sure that in the settings here you see that this is actually 7.1.2. It depends a little bit on the plugin format, if that actually works. And this is one of the things that actually doesn't work on a Mac as well as it does in Windows. On a Mac, I could not get audio units to work. I always needed to revert to VST3s. Anyway, just make sure that the settings here show that this is actually 7.1.2 and not stereo. Only then you will actually have that as a 7.1.2 reverb. And then there's one additional thing that I would also recommend that everybody makes sure, and that is that the plugin actually identifies the track correctly. In Liquid Sonics Cinematic Rooms, what you can do is you can go into the settings here, and then essentially you see in the master settings here that this is 7.1.2. In previous versions of Liquid Sonics, and by the way, Cinematic Rooms got updated only a couple of days ago, so you might need to actually, if you use the reverb, you might need to update that. In the previous version, it did not identify the channel layout correctly. So just make sure that everything is correct. This is now on a 7.1.2 track and everything should just work fine. And if I'm now playing the audio, I should essentially hear the objects coming through to the object channels and the reverb essentially coming in as something that is sent through the bed. So let's see let's hear how that actually sounds. So as you can see, Cinematic Rooms is now sending out the audio on the bed channels and it's coming in on the bed. The dry wet mix is set to wet completely, and I can now control the amount of reverb by going into the settings here. So as you can see, everything very simple, very straightforward to use. Now, one thing that you would normally do is that you would pan the signal that goes into the bed track in the same way that you would pan the signal that goes into the object track, because you want to make sure that this reverb that is generated in the bed is actually correct with respect to the position of the individual objects. Now, some digital audio workstations like Pro Tools or Nuendo or Cubase allow you to link the panners. Unfortunately, in Studio One, this is not possible. So I have essentially separate panners here. I have a panner here for the object, for the send that goes into the bed, and I have a panner here for the object. And unfortunately, I cannot link those. This would be a nice feature if somebody from Presonus is listening. That actually I think would be super useful if we would be able to actually link those. Unfortunately, you can only link those panners if they are essentially the same panners, so I cannot link a surround panner with an object panner. If I go into the settings here and I essentially kind of go into the settings, I see that this lock pan to channel is is grayed out, so I cannot really use that, which is a bit unfortunate. It would be nice if that could be locked. So I need to make manually sure that if I'm, for example, moving the object to the left, that I also move the information that is sent to the surround to the reverb that is also panned to the left, in order to make sure that everything sounds correct. Now, if you're working with multi-channel third-party plugins in Studio One, I highly recommend that you double-check that the channel layout is communicated correctly between Studio One and your plugins, because that can be a little bit wonky. And in order to show you what I mean, let me do one thing here. Now what I'm going to do now is I'm going to add an instance of block Bidule to my bed track, and the only reason I'm going to do that is in order to show you where the signal actually comes in on those 10 bed channels. So let me just add a Bidule instance here. Here we have Bidule, and I don't really need the mixer here, so let me just delete the mixer, and then let's just connect the inputs of a Bidule with the outputs. And here we are. And then let's open up the monitor, which essentially shows me where the signal is coming in and where the signal is going. And then I need to also kind of move that up so that it is in front of cinematic rooms. And with that, I can now essentially monitor where exactly the signal is coming in. So let me just play that again. And what I'm going to do is I'm probably going to, in the surround panel, fold that so that we have a mono signal. And if I'm now moving that, and I enabled snap here, if I'm moving that, for example, to the center channel, I essentially see that the signal is coming in at the center channel. Now, what I wanted to show is if I'm now moving that around, so let me just kind of move that to the right channel maybe. I see it's coming in at the right channel. However, and this is something to consider, the right surround channel is actually where many plugins would expect the rear surround channel. So the right surround channel here comes in at channel number 8. And the rear surround is coming in at channel number 6. And many plugins operate under the assumption that actually the surround comes in at 6 and the rear surround comes in at 8. So when you're working with third-party plugins, make sure that you test everything out and that the channels are actually coming in where they're supposed to come in. With cinematic rooms and with many other plugins, so let me just kind of delete Bidule again, we don't need that anymore. But with many plugins such as cinematic rooms, for example, there is usually an option. So if I go into the, let me just kind of close that here again, and I go into the settings, in the configuration settings, I have here a selection flip rear and side ordering, and that would essentially kind of change that around in case it comes in wrongly. Many plugins allow you to do that, and if you are kind of somebody who has worked with surround sound for quite some while, you know exactly how that goes. But if you're new to Dolby Atmos, be sure that you double check that the plugin actually takes in the channels in exactly the order that Studio One sends them out. So let's add 2 more tracks to our little project, and then let's export everything as a master file. So let me just close cinematic rooms and maybe also the renderer, and we also don't need the panner right now. I should probably set the original panner back to where it was. So let me go back and set that to 100%, and then let's kind of move that back. The track was somewhere here. Doesn't really matter for this particular example. And then I'm going to add 2 additional, there's like a key, there's like a bass here. Let's put that here, and then we have keys. Let's put them here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn those into objects. So once again, I'm doing that by switching the surround panner into the spatial object panner. I'm going to do that for both. And then I'm also going to make sure that I have a reverb going on. So I also need to add the send into the main. And same thing here. And that will essentially now make sure that all these tracks are, first of all, used as objects in the Dolby Atmos renderer. And they're also sent as part of the bed into the bed track, and in the bed track they essentially are hitting cinematic rooms as a reverb, so essentially kind of are turning that into the reverb. So let's just play that again. That's probably a little much. The reverb here is fine. And then let's maybe kind of move them around a little. So let's kind of move them. Yeah, let's do that like that. So the bass like on the far left and maybe a little up. And let's do the same thing for the send that goes into the reverb, just to make sure that that is consistent. And then we have the final one, which were the keys here. Let's maybe kind of move them to the back. It's maybe like that. And then the same thing for the send here. They were at the back. Yeah, that's probably kind of just make them as wide as possible. That should be fine. And essentially also up a little. So let's see how everything... Here I have the individual objects and I have the reverb that is in the bed. And that is a little Atmos project. So let's see what do I have to do in order to export that as a Dolby Atmos master file. And in Studio One, this is extremely simple. All I really need to do is I need to go into the song and I need to say export spatial audio. That's really all I need to do. And I'm going to drop that on the desktop. I can select if there are additional mixdowns that I want to send. And this is not something that I'm going to do now. I'm just going to send that out as a master file, which is an EDM BWF file. And I'm going to just send out that loop. And I'm going to say OK. And that sends that out. And now I have that on my desktop. And that is now a master file. Now, people who have never worked with Dolby Atmos are usually confused by those master files because they look like regular audio files, but they aren't. There's additional information in there. So if you now take that WAV file, that EDMBWF master file, and you play that back on a regular music player that is not Dolby Atmos capable, you will not hear everything. You will only hear the first two channels. The master file itself contains all the additional information from the Atmos project and contains the bed channels, all the object channels, all the panning information from the individual objects. And so you need a special piece of software in order to be able to actually play these master files. However, and this is a nice thing about Studio One is actually capable of loading in BWF files, master files, and that is actually super simple. So let me show you how that works. And for that, I'm going to open up a completely new session of Studio One. So let me just open up a new song session here. And I'm just going to leave it in exactly the way it is. And all I really need to do is I need to take that master file. This was the master file here. And I'm going to drop that into Studio One. And as soon as I do that, it converts everything into a Dolby Atmos project. I have the renderer here. I have the individual object here. I have the bed here. And everything is set up in exactly the way it's supposed to be set up. Now, in case you're wondering why there are 6 objects now, I only had 3 tracks. And that is because these were actually stereo pairs. So it converted the 3 stereo tracks into 6 individual objects. That's everything there is to it. Now, this is quite frankly the most convenient way of importing Dolby Atmos master files that I've seen anywhere. There's no other DAW that makes this as easy as Studio One, and this is a super interesting feature. This also means that you could technically use these Dolby Atmos master files as something that you can use in order to exchange from one digital audio workstation to another. So you can create a Dolby Atmos master file in Nuendo, for example, and Pro Tools, and then simply drop that into Studio One, and then you can maybe even continue working on that in Studio One. If I now play that, obviously, I'm going to hear it in exactly the way it was supposed to be heard, with the bed channels and the individual objects, and everything is just working fine. But as people say, where there's light, there's also shadow, so not everything is working in exactly the way you would expect it to work. And there's one thing that I find particularly annoying, and that has to do with the way Studio One treats plugins that are set after the renderer. And in order to show you what I mean, let me go back to the original project. Now, if you look at the track that holds the Dolby Atmos renderer, you actually see 2 areas where you can put insets in. And the first one is the area where we put the reverb. So those are essentially all plugins that I applied to the bed track. So that those are essentially kind of used for manipulating the bed. And then you also have this post section. And this post section is actually really interesting in principle. What this is supposed to do is it's supposed to allow you to put plugins after the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this can be useful, for example, if you have any room correction for your speaker setup, or you are using a external binaural renderer in order to implement head tracking for these kind of things. Unfortunately, the way it works is a little bit quirky. And this has to do with the fact that this part of the track actually needs to dynamically scale. So at the moment, the Dolby Atmos renderer is putting out in stereo, and that essentially means at the moment any plugin that I'm putting here is considered a stereo plugin. If I change that to 9.1.6, for example, then this will identify as a 9.1.6 track. So if I'm now putting something here on the post after the renderer, and let me once again do a Bidule track, for example, a Bidule plugin, you essentially see that Bidule has correctly identified this as a 9.1.6 or a 16-channel track. And let me just kind of connect that again in order to demonstrate what the problem is. Now, if I'm now switching that back to a lower channel count, so let me kind of maybe switch the output back to maybe back to stereo again. Bidule will dynamically identify this as a stereo track and essentially change accordingly. The problem arises from the fact that if I'm now switching that back to 9.1.6, that settings that I set are now lost, and that is a bit annoying. It's particularly annoying because this also happens when you save and reload a project. And let me show what I mean by that. Let me first collect those again. Here we are. And then let's save that and let's open that up again. So I'm going to save that, file save. And then let's open that up again. So here we have the project that we just saved. Now, Bidule is still here. Everything seems to be perfectly fine. However, if I'm now opening up Bidule, I see that I lost a number of channels. And the reason for that seems to be that because of the order according to which Studio One is scaling that track to different channel counts. So it seems to be, because it leaves 10 channels untouched. So it seems to be that it assumes that this is a 10-channel track, because once again, the Dolby Atmos renderer sits on this track that is supposed to be the bed, which is a 7.1.2 track. So there are 10 channels. And what seems to happen is that it first loads in the plugins that are after the renderer. The plugins then think they are on a 10-channel track. And after that, Studio One scales that up to 16 channels. And that essentially means any settings that I've set for the remaining 6 channels are lost. And this is a little bit annoying. This seems to be a bug in the system. I hope that Presonus is going to fix that so that we can actually make better use of these inserts that are set after the renderer, because in the current situation, it makes it almost impossible to really use inserts after the Dolby Atmos renderer unless you're using inserts that have less than 10 channels. But that, to me at least, is not really kind of the main use for these types of inserts. Once again, what you would normally do is you would use that for essentially making sure that the speakers are configured properly and everything is balanced correctly. So, for example, with Sonarworks multi-channel, and you run the risk of essentially losing some of the settings here because it kind of misidentifies the track as a 10-channel track when the plugin is first loaded. And there's one additional issue with 9.1.6 layouts in particular, and that is that the channel layout doesn't seem to be communicated correctly from Studio One to the plugins. I talked to one plugin developer and he told me that there seems to be a bug in the system that prevents plugins from essentially identifying the channel layout correctly. So if you are working with higher channel layouts, and this is particular for 7.1.4 and 9.1.6, I would highly recommend that you stick with the native plugins that come with Studio One, because those most likely work. And if you're using third-party plugins, make sure that you test them thoroughly to make sure that everything is communicated correctly and the channels are exactly where they're supposed to be. And for the moment being, I would also recommend to stay away from any plugins that you put after the renderer, which is a little bit unfortunate because those would be super useful for room correction or other things, for example. But for the moment being, it seems to be that this isn't really functional enough to be usable. So if you're using any room correction software, for example, use that externally and not as a plugin within your Dolby Atmos sessions in Studio One. And then there's one additional annoyance that I just wanted to show you, and for that, let me maybe kind of delete the Bidule plugin because I don't really need that anymore. And then what I'm going to do is I'm also going to switch the output format back to stereo. And what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to simply mute 2 of those tracks because I want to just have one track active. So if I'm playing that now, Let's open up the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now, one of the things is that if you have an object that is also sent into the bed channel as a reverb, what you would normally like to do is that if I'm muting an object, that it only mutes the object and not also the bed. But the problem really is that in this particular case, the mute button doesn't really mute the object, it mutes the object track. So if you have that track routed into the bed, and if I now put kind of mute here, it will also mute the bed track. And that is a little bit unfortunate, because I would sometimes maybe want to just kind of mute the object part of that track and not the reverb part. And unfortunately, you can't really do that from within the Dolby Atmos renderer. But once again, this is just an annoyance. This isn't really a big deal. Obviously, you can do that by simply kind of muting the sends, and then everything is fine. But I just thought I mentioned it because that would be really useful if you could mute just the object part or just the bed part. So what's my final verdict? Well, first of all, I have to say that this is an outstanding first attempt by Presonus. What they have done is they've created a Dolby Atmos workflow that I think currently is second to none. It is really easy to use. You don't need to know a lot about Dolby Atmos. You can get started right away. Everything is very natural. Export is very natural. You can drop Dolby Atmos Masterfiles into your session and it just works. It is easier than the workflow that you have with Logic, which says a lot. And it's also available on Windows, but at the same time, it also has more functionality than Logic has. So it's sort of really the best of both worlds. So if you're new to Dolby Atmos, if you're interested in Dolby Atmos, Studio One might be the way to go. Now, obviously, with any first attempt, there are also things that I would like to see, that I would like to have added. And I've talked about those. First of all, I would like to have the possibility to link an object panel with the surround panel in order to be able to simultaneously control the signal that goes into the reverb and into the objects. That would be nice. I would like to see tracks with higher channel counts be routable into objects. You know, kind of a lot of digital audio workstations do that. Pro Tools does that. There isn't really any reason why this shouldn't be possible. I would like to see instruments with higher channel counts. That would be nice as well. There is a workaround right now, but that is a little convoluted, so it doesn't really work particularly well. But it would be nice to have multi-channel instruments that I could use. I would like to be able to also mute the objects independently from the bed tracks in the Dolby Atmos renderer, something that is, for example, done by the Dolby Atmos composer from Fiedler Audio. So kind of that functionality would be really nice. And that kind of goes a little bit further than that. I would like to see head tracking support. Now, I could kind of implement head tracking through a plugin that I put on the inserts after the Dolby Atmos renderer, but as we have seen, that currently doesn't really work particularly well. So at the moment, we are a little bit limited in what we can do in terms of head tracking. And then it would also be nice if there would be a possibility to create quality control deliverables. For those of you who don't know, those are MP4 files that are encoded in a very special format. Unfortunately, at the moment at least, the only way to create those quality control deliverables is through the Dolby Atmos renderer from Dolby themselves. No digital audio workstation that has an integrated Dolby Atmos workflow can create those. So this is not really something that I would hold against Presonus, because no other workstation or no other digital audio workstation can do that right now. And the one thing that I think is indeed a bug in Studio One is the way inserts are treated after the Dolby Atmos renderer, and the fact that this dynamic scaling of that part of the track, so if you're essentially kind of changing the output to higher channel counts, it kind of changes the track layout dynamically, is not really working particularly well, and makes it, even though it is an extremely interesting idea, at the moment at least, completely unusable. But this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching my videos. If you have any thoughts, any questions or comments, please use the comment section below, or you can also join our Discord community. An invite link is in the description below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.